Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at natural resources, all the things that we would dig out of the ground, so from the crust of the earth. So in terms of the land itself, the soil and the materials that make up that land, anything that you would mine from that land. So the different, all of them raising different questions, ethical questions, questions concerning society and fairness and distribution, all of that, because it's a very complicated issue. But remember that a resource is something that man can use, something that they can exploit, something that they're going to use up. So resources, remember, can be energy resources. It can also be material resources, things that we actually use. So trees for building houses or to make paper, or minerals to make plastics or medicine or whatever. So anything that you would dig out of the ground or harvest from the ground or farm could be a resource. So the first resources we're going to look at, and we're going to do this pretty quickly today because there's so many, is the land resources. Land itself is a resource. Okay, they're not making any more of it. And as the population of the earth gets bigger, we have to live somewhere. So what happens is that rich people tend to live on huge stretches of land for themselves, and then the poor people are all crammed into densely populated slums. Okay, so you start now having questions of equity and fairness. Is that fair? What does that mean? Okay, so wars have been fought over land, I promise. Okay, so it's not just the land as land, but what the land produces. So topsoil, as you start digging around and you want topsoil, you have to dig topsoil from somewhere else. You have to leave somewhere else depleted in order for you to bring topsoil in and put on your yard. Okay, so that is something, that is a resource that is actually land itself. It's dirt that people want and are willing to trade for, pay for, whatever, steal. Now, one of the things that was first, I believe this is actually something from the United States, is that you had, instead of everything being privately owned, okay, private property being so important to so many people, and you end up with wealthy people owning thousands of acres of park, and then they're the only ones that can enjoy it, and everybody else in cramped, slummy conditions. The United States, realizing that we had an enormous country, started setting aside land that was publicly managed. So not in private ownership, but public ownership. And so some of that land is owned by the the federal government, some by the states, other by municipalities. You can have parks inside a city that nobody in that city actually owns. It's public property, and then taken care of at the public expense, because it's a general good to have a nice place to walk and a place to play with your kids and your dogs, and that's important. I guess you see it less when you're in more and more rural places, because there are places you can get away to. But when you're in dense cities, you really can't get away, and a park is totally necessary. So the idea of taking the most beautiful places in the United States and setting them aside for the entire public of the United States is a very interesting idea, and it wasn't done before the early 1900s in the U.S. Now you're going to see that parks and whatever are generally all over the world. People have taken this model, but I believe it's an American model, so Yankee Doodle. So there are lots of parks out west. Now that's interesting. You don't have a lot of parks out east, even though there are beautiful places in the east, but you had private ownership. The East was colonized and settled long before the West was, and the West was still open land for a long period of time. And so when people started having these ideas that these beautiful, beautiful spots were not bought up by Mr. Rich Millionaire who would put his summer house there and nobody else was allowed to see it, they set these aside. And so even the farther east you get, tend to be more expensive for the government, because more and more people would be, say, living in a valley that's particularly beautiful, and you would have to buy out all of the people that live there rather than open land where no one lived there yet. So you're going to see lots more parks in the west than you would in the east. You also have wildlife refuges, so places where you have migratory birds. If you look at the dense packed there along the middle of the United States, that's where the birds are flying. So the birds are flying, migrating from Canada to the Caribbean year after year. So you have these refuges to have habitats to save some animals that would only be able to live there, or breeding areas, sanctuaries, so that you do not have hunting, so that these animals do not go extinct. So it's preserving the natural resources and the land at the same time. So they act as public lands, but they're managed publicly. Now, we have already talked about the land itself being the dirt and the area. So soil is definitely a resource, and if you are not careful and you don't take care of it, once it blows away, it's gone. So you can have, once the topsoil is eroded, it is capable of growing less and less and less. All right, so can't tell you how many pictures I could find on that. So you can actually get to the point where if it's dry enough and you lose your topsoil, that area becomes a desert. It doesn't just become not profitable or not productive, but it becomes a desert, and that's called desertification. Desertification, I guess, is where the whole land becomes desert. And one of the things that you wouldn't imagine is in some of the most lush tropical places like rainforests, you can make a rainforest into a desert within one generation, because if you cut down all those trees so that you can have grasslands for your cows, and that soil then erodes, well, that soil that may have taken 10,000 years or 20,000 or 100,000 years to form can be gone in a year, and then nothing will grow on it again. And that's very, 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 very possible, because especially as poor people have no other resource, and they're being exploited by other powerful interests. It's a very, very dangerous thing to do, and you can actually have land that will never be profitable again. You'll never be able to grow anything again. Now, the aggregates are the different. This is geology now. The different things that you need. So if you're going to make concrete, if you're going to make a bridge or a building, you're going to need certain minerals and rocks and powders and mortars and all kinds of things that is different. You would get them from the land. You would actually harvest sand. You would harvest granite and stuff to make gravels out of and mortars out of. Bedrock, solid rock, can also act as a resource. You can cut them. You can have marble. You can have countertops made out of stone. You can have your tombstone made out of stone. You can have the foundation of your beautiful steps made out of stone. It depends on how rich you are. So it could be considered a resource. And it can't be found again. How long does it take to make granite? Okay. Now, once you start getting into very valuable things, ores come to mind. So minerals that are in rocks that you could then mine those rocks and sell those minerals. So the more you would have an iPhone, you're going to have precious metals in that iPhone that have to be mined places, and usually very poor countries mining them at great danger to themselves. Crystals can form inside rocks. So like at the bottoms of volcanoes, you can end up with deposits of certain metals, and then you can mine those metals. Okay, so if you want chromium or platinum is a very expensive white, like a whitish metal. Hydrothermal is how gold and copper is taken into a rock. So they would dissolve into hot water, and then when that hot water evaporates into a rock, you end up with veins. So you could have a vein of silver, or a vein of gold, or a vein of copper. You can also have other ores. So iron, a lot of times if you were to see stone that's brownish color, what's happen is you've got some kind of a sandstone with iron that's leached through that stone, and now you can actually get that iron back out of it by taking the stone and breaking it up and getting the iron out. So there's different kinds of precipitation. Now nuggets, if you were to ever hear of like gold dust or gold nuggets, that's called placer deposits. And placer deposits are large deposits that are settled out in other type of sediments. So like in sedimentary rocks, you could actually find certain little pieces of gold or titanium or tin or something like that, or even diamonds and rubies and sapphires. You could mine them. And a lot of times the gold rush and these rushes towards the west in the early mid-1800s were all about finding these deposits that you could simply pan out, okay? And then most of the time you want to mine these, and that brings up a whole series of environmental questions. What are we doing to the land by mining all these minerals? What are we doing by allowing then this material to erode into the environment? So does it leach out? So for instance, once you mine something, you're usually going to have these ponds and pools of totally polluted water. This is called tailings. Like the tail end of your mining operation, you have all this leachy water that's running out. If you were to get into the groundwater or into a river, you pollute not just that area, but you pollute areas downstream or anywhere that would be in contact with that water that you've essentially poisoned people's wells. And then mining also has other dangers in terms of it just being dangerous. More people die in the United States from mining than most other occupations. It's one of the most dangerous occupations. I have been in places where miners are finding out that their loved ones have been killed in the mines. That's devastating to whole communities. So there is a social cost, not just a cost environmentally, not just a cost financially, but in terms of to get these things that we're willing to pay for, how dearly do we have to pay for them?